Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos, and I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. The winds of economic doom and gloom is the daily experience of tens of millions in the country and hundreds of millions around the world. Headlines speak to that truth. Anemic jobs report reaffirms pandemic's grip on economy. Labor market offers little relief to the nearly 10 million Americans who are unemployed. The pandemic's toll on housing, falling behind, doubling up. Catastrophic moral failure as wealthy nations hoard vaccines. Who owns stocks? Explaining the rise in inequality during the pandemic, an imploding job market, a roaring stock market. European bankruptcies are plummeting. That may be a problem. Government and their aid may only be postponing a painful reckoning. And the headlines go on and on. Today, we welcome Michael Hudson back to the Radical Imagination to discuss these and other economic and moral issues. Michael was one of the 8 economists named by the Financial Times who foresaw the credit crisis and ensuing Great Recession erupting in 2008. As he explained on his last visit to the show, the Wall Street establishment of economic policymakers and financiers missed the crisis around them because they simply didn't understand how the world of finance really works. They failed to see that their innocent world models and designs were worlds where debt simply didn't exist. It's no wonder that everyday people see most economists far removed, unresponsive, and tone deaf to their practical daily economic concerns, interests, fears, and struggles. The world of these economists and financiers was, and even more frighteningly still is, largely a world of celebrating the wealthy rentier class. Michael predicted the economic pain we're experiencing now would be even more severe than the virus itself, and he's been proven right. As he's written, we're failing to see and come to grips with the looming global fracture that's becoming a fight against the most basic organizing principles of civilization. All successful economies throughout history have been mixed economies. To promote survival and prosperity, it's necessary for the 1% to subordinate their public wealth accumulation to public objectives that would also benefit the 99%. Yet the US still seems to be fighting against and resisting that principle. We're not sure yet what the economic winds of change will bring under the new Biden administration in this battle. As Michael puts it, we're truly in a fight between a more broadly based prosperity of democratic socialism and the polarized income and wealth accumulation of a 1% predatory barbarism. Michael is a distinguished research professor of economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, a researcher at the Levy Economics Institute at Bard College, a Wall Street analyst, political consultant to government on finance and tax policy, a popular commentator and sought-after speaker and journalist, and a contributor to the Hudson Report, a weekly economic and financial news podcast produced by Left Out. His many books include Killing the Host, J is for Junk Economics, The Bubble and Beyond, Super Imperialism, and Forgive Them Their Debts. So Michael, thank you so very, very much for being on the Radical Imagination again. We had a record number of viewers last time on the show. So obviously your message resonates with so many people. And we're so blessed to have you back here again. Thank you, Michael. Wonderful, wonderful. Listen, there's so much to cover, so many things to ask you. So let's just really dive in here. First question. We're waiting to see how the rhetoric of the new Biden administration will play out in actual policies. In our polarized economy, wages have stagnated since 1971. Home ownership rates have fallen, and foreclosures, evictions, and homelessness have jumped dramatically. It's most severe and unstable at the bottom of the housing market, where tenants have lost jobs, have amassed $11 billion in rental arrears. And if you want to make a broader measure, and including all delinquent renters, that number is 53 billion. What are some of the specific racial effects of this housing and job crisis? What's been the Biden administration's response so far? And how does this relate to your own work on racial reparations?
Well, how can I remember all those questions?
So one by one, part by part.
Okay. We'll begin with the beginning.
Yes.
Something about Biden, I think there was.
Right.
His whole long political career has been right-wing. He's a senator from Delaware, and that's the country's most pro-corporate state. That's where most U.S. corporations are incorporated because of its corporate-friendly laws. So that means that he's representing the banking and the credit card industry. And he sponsored the regressive bankruptcy reform written and put into his hands by the credit card companies that prevented many people from wiping out their debts in bankruptcy, and which made it impossible to wipe out student loan debts. He's also a budget hawk, and he's reiterated that even in recent years. He's rejected modern monetary theory, and he's also rejected Medicare for all. He says it's all too expensive for the government to afford. There's only one thing the government can afford that he approves. That is buying stocks and bonds and supporting Wall Street. And on Tuesday, February 9th, he invited Jamie Dimon and a number of business leaders to the White House and said, what is it that you think we need? Especially, what do you think of the $1,400 tax? We can't afford to give, the Democrats cannot afford to give as much as Donald Trump did, but they can give maybe 3/4. But Dimon said, I don't have any problem with money. I don't need a check. And the Walmart executive said he didn't need a check. And so, you don't want to print more money because that's going to create inflation, when the whole business of the Federal Reserve, the whole business of the government is to inflate housing prices, inflate stock and bond prices. So it's almost bizarre to see what's happening, or how he's going to be able, Biden and his administration is going to be able to solve things. Well, hardly by surprise, look at the cabinet ministers that he's appointed. They're mainly corporate lobbyists, including the Secretary of Defense, who moved from being a lobbyist for the military industrial complex right back to the person who's going to be hiring the products and making profits for the companies that he's just left on leave for, until he goes back when he leaves his job. So I think Biden's prejudices are precisely why the Democratic National Committee pushed him as their candidate over Sanders, and why Representative Jim Clyburn made his pharmaceutical industry backers happy by pushing Biden over the top in South Carolina, delivering the black vote instead of supporting Sanders, whose Medicare for all would not exactly help the pharmaceutical industry. So what amazes me is that Biden's ability to attract this vote, despite the degree to which his sponsored legislation that hurts blacks and other minorities.
Right.
Yeah, his cutbacks in welfare spending under the Clinton administration, his anti-crime laws falling mainly on the black community, his bankruptcy laws falling mainly on the less affluent, and of course his denial of universal public medical care to the part of the population with the highest death rates, the shortest lifespan, and the worst medical care. If there's any identity politics group that should be supporting public medical care, it would be the blacks and other low-income workers, because they're the ones who aren't insured. They're the ones who are stuck with medical bills. They're the ones suffering medical bankruptcy. And I don't see how there can be much help for them unless Biden and the Democrats make an about face and become the opposite of the party they've been for the last 30 years. To cap matters, Biden tried to cover up the history by appointing Neera Tanden as head of the budget, claiming that she's a progressive simply because she's non-white. Biden's idea of a progressive is to be non-white, and especially a non-white whose main financial support comes from the finance sector and the real estate sector and the military sector. So she's a leading opponent of Medicare for all proposals. So this is not very promising for how to get out of this. Your next question was about in a polarized economy,
Yeah.
what's happening to home ownerships and rents. I mean, that's the real, once he deals with the COVID crisis, that's the real crisis, economic crisis that's looming. And all I can really talk about is the economic crisis, because that's my field. And the big decline in home ownership, really since the decline has occurred since 2008. It's the result of President Obama double-crossing his campaign promises by bailing out the banks and leaving the junk mortgage debts and fraudulent loans in place. Well, that led to foreclosures and evictions of about 9 million American families. He had promised that he would write down their mortgages to the realistic levels. But then the bank said, wait a minute, we can't make this big profit. So he called the bankers to the White House and said, "Don't worry, I'm going to support you, not the voters." And so it probably the most anti-Black, anti-Hispanic policies in the last 20 years have been by Obama and by Clinton, and with Biden being Obama's vice president right along. Home ownership rates have plunged from 68% when Obama took office to 61% of the population. That's an enormous 10% drop. Right now, we're on the precipice of another drop. The COVID epidemic is leading to enormous arrears mounting up for rents, for wages not made, for renters, and also for mortgage debtors who have trouble paying because of the economic downturn. Evictions have been suspended by moratoriums that are going to expire in March and April. Those are the big jumps in when state moratoriums end and landlords are able to foreclose and throw the existing tenants out into the street. At least some mortgage companies have said, well, okay, we're not going to foreclose on your homes. We're just going to add the debt at the end of we're going to just prolong your mortgages and put it at the end and charge you appropriate late fees every month so that we can make money off your disaster. I mean, and basically, disasters are what enable the very wealthiest classes to make more money. So the question is whether Biden can outdo Obama in reducing home ownership by another 10%. Can he reduce home ownership to 56% of the population? Another 10% drop by following policies that he's been supporting all of his political life. Well, let's look at what could be done today and a decade ago. Obama and Biden could have written down the junk mortgages to realistic market prices and thrown the mortgage brokers and the bankers in jail, but instead they supported the fraudsters against the voters who had been promised hope and change. Most of the millions of foreclosed homes were bought by absentee owners, turned into rental property, and companies like Blackstone bought them up, became major players. The evicted families had become renters. And so you had all of a sudden the rental market rising, rents rose and are still rising. And the result is that more and more consumer income in the US economy in general has to be spent much more on real estate, finance, and insurance than on goods and services. And that's why the economy is basically shrinking right now, and why I don't see how it's going to recover to what it was before unless you somehow deal with this accumulation of debt and rent arrears. Well, there are two kinds. You mentioned that there were 11 billion in rent arrears, and actually the overall delinquency number is 53 billion.
Right.
There are two kinds of results that can occur. The first is going to be an enormous accrual of back rent debts and mortgage arrears to be paid off. Now, if you're a commercial business, like a restaurant, these arrears are so large that you're probably going to choose just to close the business instead of paying all the profits for the next few years just on to the landlord for rents that weren't producing any income for you. And unless these debts are written down, then most of the population is going to be too debt strapped to buy goods and services. So corporate profits can only come from raising prices rather than actually producing more, or they can get government subsidy, which is what they're asking for. Well, a second result is going to be the rise in homelessness in many cities. Entire camps of evictees may be forming in tents, maybe in parks, or on the subways, as occurs in New York. A lot of properties are going to be sold into a market where housing prices are still going up because people who have money are trying to buy real estate, turn it into rental market. So you're having the US economy being rolled back from an owner-occupied housing economy into a rental economy. And you'd asked about what the racial effects of all of these are, because the effects are not felt across the economy. They're felt above all in the non-white population. And there are a number of reasons for that. I think the low rates of Black homeownership reflect a vicious history of redlining, limiting the areas where only whites can buy, forcing non-whites to buy into special, let's call them slums, where they have to pay much higher interest rates than white buyers receive. And there's a reason for that. Housing is the basic criterion of being a member of the middle class. And for a century, Blacks were excluded not only by the banks, but by the government mortgage insurance programs from Franklin Roosevelt's reforms in the 1930s. Now, that is what made Black buyers more risky and hence charged a higher rate because you didn't have government fallback. The government wouldn't insure mortgages unless you were white. Now, but also you had the real estate speculators making a lot of money off this. I grew up in Hyde Park in Chicago because I attended the universities, the grade school and high school and college. And the University of Chicago and its property managers were among the worst abusers of redlining. For them, a free market meant a market free from Blacks. And by the late 1950s, when I was a teenager, they saw that they could do blockbusting. That is, they'd sell a home in a white neighborhood to a Black buyer. This would panic the neighborhood owners who sold their homes. Now, the major buyers were not white. The major buyers were the real estate management companies in the University of Chicago, who then raised the price very sharply to Black buyers, saying, if you want to live in a white neighborhood, that's a change of status. You're not only buying a home, you're buying a change in status in the neighborhood. So the university and speculators became the beneficiaries. Now, I lived at 48th and Dorchester, one block from where President Obama had his home on 48th and 49th and Kenwood. So only a few houses changed hands. And you got about just as many Black families as could afford to move into that nice neighborhood. So then Mayor Daley condemned the whole block. My house was torn down, other houses were torn down, and so were others, and the whole land was gentrified. So everybody who bought it lost their land and got a token payment from the city. So that's how I grew up watching what redlining was. And to put the whole issue in perspective, think of the situation that existed in America in 1945. That's when the great increase in middle class wealth for the last 75 years took off. It was limited to white people because they were the only people who could qualify for mortgages and begin to rise the great increase in net worth that's created by the housing price boom over the last 75 years. Middle-class families got their money by the increased price of their housing. It was only available to white people. So the norm was that banks would limit their mortgages to a level that could absorb up to 25% of the mortgage borrower's salary. The buyer, in exchange for 25% of your salary, the buyer would get a self-amortizing mortgage that paid itself off free and clear after 30 years. And this limit on debt leveraging kept housing prices level because a house is worth whatever a bank will lend. And if bank will only lend enough that you can afford to pay, then obviously housing prices are going to be lower. So you and I have spoken about Black reparations before, and it's very hard to pay reparations for slavery because so many generations have occurred since the slave era, and the actual enslaved victims died long ago. The reparations need to be paid to the living because they're the only people who can receive it. And the fact is, it's the living Blacks today that remain injured. There's a reason that they today, quite apart from the slavery issue, deserve reparations. And that's because of their systematic exclusion from the middle class and from the real estate market. So there's only one way to make the Black population economically resilient as the white population has been. And that's to give them the same deal that created most white middle class wealth. The government should either buy or build homes, private homes, just like white neighborhoods have, not public housing like Chicago had to tear down. And the government should offer buyers the same deal that was given white buyers in 1945. Any Black family can be given a home in exchange for committing 25% of their income to buy a mortgage that will automatically pay off the price of the home in 30 years. Now, suppose you're a Black buyer, but you're owning a minimum wage of $25,000 a year. Then to give them the same deal that the white people have, 25% of that $25,000 income, that's $6,250. That's about $500 a month. Over 30 years, the buyer will pay $187,000, most of it for interest, guaranteed by the Federal Housing Authority, so the banks won't lose money, just as they don't lose money on white mortgages. And as a practical political matter, of course, such a windfall would have to be offered to all Americans across the board. You can't say we're all going to give a whole windfall to Black buyers that poor whites don't have, and poor Hispanics don't have, and immigrants don't have. So the fact is, solving the Black problem will have to entail solving the problem of poverty in the United States as a whole. It'll have to cross racial lines. And that's what so terrifies the banks and the white leadership. The fact that it would cross racial lines and cross ethnic lines, and you can't divide the voters into identity politics fighting against each other. And if you don't have a special subsidy of this sort, there cannot be any serious talk of equality. Minority buyers were the great victims of the great mortgage run-up and the Obama evictions. And the person who's hurt the most is Obama, followed by Biden himself. And they have to realize that in order to realize just how they were hurt and why they were hurt and what constituency Obama and Biden were working for.
So it's again, the Black leadership as well as or certain segments of it are threatened by what you're proposing as well.
Well, if you're a member of the Ku Klux Klan, or if you're a member of the financial sector and you want to have a policy that hurts the Blacks, you're not going to have a Ku Klux Klan leader leading it. You're going to say, how can we find a Black leader to take our Ku Klux Klan and racist anti-Black policy? And the answer is, let's find someone who will accept a lot of money, a lot of campaign contributions, promising to support what we want. No public medical care. That would be for the poor. It should be only the rich should afford medical care. Let's have them oppose Bernie Sanders. Let's have them oppose student loans. You want someone like Jim Clyburn, and that's the Black leadership. You want someone who's very tough on jailing Blacks. You want someone like Bill Clinton or Joe Biden or Kamala Harris.
Kamala Harris, absolutely.
So the question is, if you can trick voters into thinking of themselves as an ethnic or racial identity instead of an economic identity, then you've got them beat, because the real way of enforcing a racist society is economic, having to do with housing, medical care, education, basic needs.
Dividing and conquering. And yet, as as we talked before, in a recent New York Times piece, David Leonard raised the question of why the US economy has fared so much better under Democratic presidents and Republicans. In fact, he accuses or argues that the gap is startlingly large when one measures the annual growth rate, the gross domestic product, growth rate, jobs, incomes, productivity, even stock prices. So,
Wait, well, let me just take it a little bit by bit. You can't answer.
sure.
If they're more than 200 words,
Sure.
I lose focus. So you've got to break the questions into parts. So
Okay.
let me answer one part, and when I answer that, then you can go on to the second.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You generally want a whole novel, and I can only
Exactly.
have one chapter
So
at a time.
why do people seem to think that under Democratic administrations, or the working class, the poor, and so on, blacks, and so on, see their lives will become better under Democratic presidents than Republicans?
Well, if I would be a comedian, I could probably give a nicer answer to you. But you began by mentioning Leonard of the New York Times.
Right.
And the New York Times has always been the leader in fake news, at least for its support of the real estate and the financial interests and the Democratic Party. It's the spokesman, the medium for real estate finance and the Democrats. And the first trick that Leonard is trying to pull is focusing on growth rates as measured by GDP. That's a travesty of reality. Since 2008, GDP for 95% of the Americans has actually declined. Pavlina Chernova, at my colleague at the Levy Institute, has produced the chart showing that all the growth in GDP since 2008 is accrued only to the wealthiest 5% of the population. We're still in the Obama depression for 95% of the population. And that was the state of affairs when the COVID-19 crisis hit. Now, when debtors fall behind and have to pay penalty interest rates to banks and credit card, this is counted as an increase in GDP. If you look at how has this GDP been growing? Well, if you cannot afford to pay your credit card, and so they say, okay, your rate is going to jump from 19% to 31% or more. This is accounted in the GDP as financial services. It's as if the bank is producing a service for you by charging you more and adding on more fees, as if somehow that's a real service and a product. And another part of GDP, 7% of GDP, is a hypothetical figure for homeowners' rental value. That's what homeowners would have to pay themselves if they rented out their homes to themselves as tenants. Well, as rents have risen since 2008, largely by absentee owners buying homes, as we mentioned, this increases GDP, but it leaves out minority owners because they're the ones who've been evicted. And their home ownership rate is much lower than that of white. So the GDP is biased against anyone but wealthy white homeowners who own stocks and bonds and are part of the creditor class. Not to mention the GDP growth and military industrial production. So what the New York Times and others looking at the GDP leave out of account is how unequal the distribution of wealth and income have become since 2008, and actually since the 1980s. Economists are now talking about a K-shaped recovery. Up for owners of stocks and bonds, the 1% who own something like 80% of these securities, and real estate, and the economy has been going down for wage earners. They're squeezed. The recovery has not been a recovery for them. It's a boom for the wealthy. It's for the rentier class, mainly in finance, insurance, and real estate, the FIRE sector. Now, that sector is the main audience for the New York Times, as I said. and for Biden's campaign contributors, by the way. And most of the Democratic donor class comes from the fire sector. So despite this, the Democratic success at identity politics has created a political situation in which only the Democrats can enact anti-labor and anti-black policies because their politicians are able to deliver the labor and black vote. That's the irony of American politics today.
Got it.
I don't see how there can be any real progress unless the Democratic Party is replaced, or at least the Democratic National Committee leadership that turned politics into demagogy, with an identity politics based on every identity except being a wage earner.
I see. Understood. Understood. How does this impact on possible foreign policy as well? And the connection between military spending and arms sales, the use of military threats enforced, if necessary, to enforce this sort of international financial and physical dominance, if you will.
Well, Biden has spent his career defending the financial sector, and its leading policy is to privatize basic infrastructure. That means blocking governments from providing basic services at cost or on a subsidized basis. Education, healthcare, roads, and communications. Yet that's how America became the leading industrial economy from the late 19th century onward. Financialization and privatization have left it a high-cost economy, uncompetitive in world markets, and that's why the economy has deindustrialized. Now, privatized and financial economies like the United States are high cost. America spends 18% of its GDP on healthcare, far more than any other country. And then there's the military budget. A year ago, January, Biden wrote in Foreign Affairs an article promising that his incoming foreign policy agenda will place the United States at the head of the table. That's his word, the head of the table. So what's he going to lead is the head of the table. He's already said that he's not going to negotiate with Iran, but to keep the Trump administration politics in place. He's appointed neocon hawks in leadership positions, especially Victoria Nuland and other anti-Russians. There's almost a passionate anti-Russian prejudice within the Democratic Party. And Biden wants to use sanctions against Russia and other countries that he has accused of being rivals or enemies. That's how he sees the world. Biden is Donald Trump. They're the same person. They've changed. He's wearing a different costume. It's really Donald Trump in there. Certainly from everything that he's doing, he's going to keep Trump's aggressive policies, and he's turning sanctions against one country after another: Russia, China, Venezuela, and Iran. And all of a sudden, what's happening is that the United States is isolating itself. It's trying to block Europe from importing low-priced Russian gas, and says buy high-priced American liquefied natural gas. It's insisting on U.S. Information technology monopolies so that China won't get it. And Biden has as little respect for treaties as Trump had. That's why he's retaining Trump's withdrawal from the Iran deal. So you've had in recent days Russia's President Putin, the foreign minister, and others saying America is not agreement capable, and they've just said they don't expect anything at all from the United States. And Europe saw when Biden was coming in, they looked at who is Biden, and they very quickly said he's going to try to impoverish us and prevent us from dealing with China so he can get American companies to deal with China. So in December, before Biden took office, they very quickly made their own deal with China. They're moving away from the United States. So Biden is saying what Trump has said: not only American first, but everybody who's not America is an enemy. And Trump says we have to win every battle, and Biden says we have to have a battle with every country. So the Democrats are now stepping up the military aggression. And when any Democratic president takes office, the first question you have to ask is, who do you plan to go to war with? Because that's the real question over overshadows everything. So even if Biden makes new treaties, Congress would have to approve the treaty. But Congress has remained firm that no foreign countries can set policy for the United States, and it insists on not subjecting itself to any international rule of law or not drawn up by its own political donors and corporate backers. So obviously, we know that the main donors don't want a renewal of the treaty with Iran. They don't want an opening to Russia. They want to isolate the United States and leave it all alone. So what we're seeing just at the beginning of the Biden administration internationally is a global fracture that's becoming a fight against the most basic organizing principles of economies really throughout history. All successful economies have been mixed, government, private, together, with the government taking over basic infrastructure, utilities, basic needs to make the economy low cost. The United States, by privatizing its infrastructure, has made itself a high cost economy, and therefore it can't compete in trade. It can only compete in monopoly products like information technology, or it can sell its liquefied natural gas if it can only block Europe from buying cheaper Russian gas. I mean, and that's Biden's policy. And he pretends that this is because of Navalny getting sick, or because you can always find someone who gets sick in some country and say it's all Putin's fault, and or whatever country you're after. And apparently that's the personification. It's like an anthropomorphic policy of national interest.
How does this $1.9 trillion stimulus package fit into this debate?
Well,
the debate between, again, the financialized, the conflict between the financialized rentier economies and democratic socialist ones.
Okay, well, financialized economies are privatized economies,
right?
Because most of the fortunes are made by buying out the public domain, just like the kleptocrats in Russia. In America, it was the railway companies that got the land from the public domain in the 19th century. And basic infrastructure is a natural monopoly. Roads and other transportation, communications, the post office. And when they're privatized, they're run for profit. And that consists mainly of monopoly rent over and above normal profits because they're natural monopolies. And also you're after capital gains as these rentier rents are capitalized into stocks and bonds. So the policy of American capitalism in the 19th century was the same as that of socialism. It's the same policy that China is following today. You want to minimize the cost of living and doing business. And you do that by the government providing free education, the government providing healthcare, the government subsidizing transportation and things that basic needs, so that the rest of the economy, the private sector, will have more money to produce the goods and services that it's producing. So privatization, basically on credit, financed by the financial sector, is largely responsible for deindustrializing the U.S. economy. And that's what's leaving 95 or 99% of the population to stagnate. It's been a bonanza for the 5 and the 1%. So as long as you're running the United States for a rentier elite, you're not going to be competitive, and you're going to have to look increasingly at the rest of the world as enemies. And whether you call it industrial policy or socialism, it's all the same thing.
Yep. So the stimulus, in a sense, is just a sort of a temporary vehicle to get people into even greater debt, in a sense.
You mean this? Basically, I don't think you should call it a stimulus. It's not a stimulus.
Okay. What you call it?
The idea is to catch up, not a stimulus. Only Wall Street's been stimulated. The stock market's been stimulated, the bond market's been stimulated, and the housing market's been stimulated to make housing more expensive and out of reach to most Americans. But the economy has not been stimulated. You're dealing with a disaster. And the idea is, how do you put the economy at least back in the pretty awful position it was in before because it was still in the Obama depression. So really the conflict, who are you going to support? Wall Street or Main Street? Are you going to support the fire sector or the industrial goods and services economy? And if the Wall Street objective and that of the Democratic Party's main donor class is to increase stock and bond prices and make capital gains, it's not to hire more workers, and it's certainly not to help workers who've lost be resilient. They say personal responsibility. Well, the fact is, it's the responsibility of the bad politicians that have created the duopoly between the Democrats and the Republican Party. So what was a stimulus was the 6 to 8 trillion created by the Federal Reserve to buy stocks and bonds and junk bonds included, and that it was not a stimulus for the rest. The 1.9 trillion dollars to finance the checks of 1,400 down from Trump's 2,000 actually should be sent out monthly, not a one part-time. Europe pays its laid off workers 80% of their normal wages in Germany, so that they won't be plowed under by the COVID shutdown. The United States is the only industrial economy that's letting its overall population, if they can't pay their rent, if they're laid off, actually be plowed under, lose their homes, be evicted onto the street and made homeless. The United States is the only policy, and they call that a free market. I mean, this is sort of like the joke about that's quite an act. What do you call it?
Yep, I understand. But there is a disagreement now on how to handle possible increased bankruptcies. Is that what's your position on that? There is
is largely
in Europe and here.
Biden is responsible for the bankruptcy problem because he was the politician who steered the regressive bankruptcy legislation called a reform through Congress and made it harder for low-income families to wipe out their debts, such as they have today, and making it impossible to wipe out student debts. So in a sense, he owes it to the economy to make up for his opportunism and water carrying for his campaign backers in Delaware. Will he do it? And can he do it? He's a deficit hawk. He's appointed Neera Tanden to his cabinet. He's promised that nothing will change. And I suspect that's true. This is just how the Obama administration was run. And Obama was a demagogue promising hope and change. His idea was to prevent change, but he used rhetoric for it because he's a good speaker. So the question is Biden going to be Obama 3.0 or maybe Trump 2.0? It really doesn't matter much because both Obama and Trump were basically Republicans running with a different ethnic profile from the voters that delivered their campaign contributors.
So Trump, in a sense, was, again, let's our audience understand, it's not all that different in a sense, economic policy, domestic economic policies as Biden or Obama?
It seems they're both serving exactly the same campaign
interest.
And Biden has already said he's not going to change Trump's policy.
Mm-hmm.
He's just going to be nicer and not be as point. If you're going to have an anti-black policy, you want black politicians to do it. That's Biden's contribution. Great reform.
So what are we left here with? We got just a couple of minutes to go. We have William Barber, the Poor People's Campaign. We have intensive organizing from the ground up, the grassroots organizing. Where are we left here in the country in terms of trying to bring about the sort of civilized harmony you're talking about here, rather than the barbaric?
You have to realize that we're not in a normal situation because of the COVID virus. The question is, how do you avoid a disaster? Europe at least realizes, how do we really prevent a disaster that's going to impoverish most of the population? Well, US policy sees disaster as an opportunity. Think if you're Blackstone and Biden has appointed Blackstone people to his cabinet. A disaster will make billions for Blackstone. They can come in, wow, they can pick up the houses that are being sold under duress. You're having the predators in control of the Democratic Party's policies because it's easier to make fortunes in a disaster than in normal times. Well, the aim of Europe and actually economies through the ages is you want to have resilience. That's what's missing in the United States today. The doctrine of individual responsibility means, you know, we're not going to take care of the problems that we've caused for you. If we blacklined you and prevented you from being a member of the middle class, that's your problem. We don't take any responsibility for it. So what is it that you can recover in a recovery? To most politicians, that means their creditors can recover the money that they're owed. It doesn't mean recovery for the debtors. Well, in Europe's system of parliamentary politics, you could have a third party. You could have a fourth party. You could have other parties arising to promote a social policy of economic resilience. That's not possible in the United States because of the two-party duopoly. And duopolies tend to merge into monopolies, which is what we actually have today. A pro-Wall Street, pro-labor, pro-creditor, an anti-debtor donor class determining who the candidates are going to be selected, who voters get to choose which one is going to act against us on behalf of their donor class.
So you see very little possibility of a viable third party also developing? We've had Nick Braun on with the People's Party.
Well, Donald Trump just said he thought of starting his own party and he realized that he couldn't do it. Bernie Sanders said that, well, he thought of a third party because it's obvious he's being cheated out of any position in the Democrats and that they're and Bernie said, you know, it just won't work. The way that the state laws are set up to run for elections, you really can't have a viable third party here. It's not a parliamentary system. The way in which American politics have been restructured, this is way beyond the Constitution, but they pretend that it's built into the Constitution, is you can only have two parties. They have to be the same party, but with different identity politics for their voters.
Understood. Michael, thank you so very much. It's really been enlightening. I appreciate so much you coming on. I know our audience really looks forward to your discussions and the dialogue that you have with us. And please come again. We need your voice and vision, and we appreciate you so very, very much. And we'll try to carry on with your message.
Well, I'm glad you asked the questions you asked.
Sorry?
I'm glad you asked the questions you asked.
I'm glad, and we're so thankful for your answers as well. There's so many more we could ask, but we are out of time. Michael, do take care, and we will see you again very, very soon. And thank you all for listening to Michael Hudson on The Radical Imagination. This is Jim Vrettos. We'll see you again next week. Thank you very, very much for listening.